start? Hi, I'd like to welcome everyone here today. We have Rand Stappers, our distinguished guest, and several distinguished community members. We're very fortunate today to have Dr. Howard Fuller as our guest speaker. And Dr. Fuller is a distinguished professor of education and founder-director of the Institute for Transformation of Learning at Marquette University in Milwaukee. Immediately before his appointment to Marquette, Dr. Fuller served as superintendent of Milwaukee Public Schools from June 1991 to 1995, just as Milwaukee was getting underway with its parental choice program. His prior positions include Director of Milwaukee County Department of Health and Human Services, Dean of General Education at Milwaukee Area Technical College, Secretary of Wisconsin Department of Employment Relations, Associate Director of the Educational Opportunity Program at Marquette University, and Senior Fellow with the Annenberg Institute for School Reform at Brown University. Dr. Fuller received his PhD in Sociological Foundations of Education from Marquette University in 1986. He's the chair of the Board of Directors of the Black Alliance for Educational Options and the chairman of the Charter School Review Committee for the City of Milwaukee. He also serves as the Board of Directors of the Trans Center for Youth, the Wisconsin United, there must be a typo here, the Wisconsin United for Health Foundation.
This is unimportant.
As the Joyce Foundation, the Johnson Foundation, and many other community and national organizations. Needless to say, he's a very distinguished guest. I just want to make a note of the fact that we have several publications related to Dr. Fuller's work at the back over there on that table, and that our next speaker will be Paul Hill on May 16th. Let's welcome Dr. Fuller.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I first want to thank you all for inviting me to California. Last weekend I was in Buffalo, so I feel like I deserve a chance to go to Santa Monica. When I left Milwaukee, it was snowing. So, essentially what I'm going to try to do is obviously not give you all a long speech. I'm hoping that I can spend most of the time really sort of answering your questions, but you know, obviously I want to set sort of a context. I was asked to talk about the lessons learned from this whole struggle over parental choice, and that's kind of what I want to focus in on, and as I said, obviously deal with questions or issues that you all might want to raise. I think it would be important though for you all to sort of understand how I got here. Basically what happened, I've only been involved in this now for 16 years. And I say only because there are people who've been involved in it much longer than me. But the way I got involved in this was that I graduated from the Milwaukee Public Schools. I graduated from North Division High School in Milwaukee. And I had been away for a while, and I'd come back to Milwaukee. And when I got back, after doing some things, I was involved at Marquette in the Educational Opportunity Program. Well, the students at my high school walked out because the school board, in its wisdom, had made a determination that they were going to turn our high school, which was, they had just built a new high school a couple of years before I got back, on the site of the old school. And their view was that the way that you turn a school around was to first of all integrate it, and secondly to kick all of the neighborhood kids out. So they built this beautiful new school, and they wanted to turn it into a citywide specialty school. And so the students walked out, they came to get me, and one thing led to another, and as an alumnus, and so I ended up heading a group called the Coalition to Save North Division. And what we were really fighting for was to keep the school as a neighborhood school. You could have a specialty program within the school, because what it really was about was attracting white kids. I mean, that was the bottom line. So the idea is kick all the black kids out and then set up a process that would be favorable to white people so that they would be willing to come into this black community and go to school. So after a year of fighting, we won the first battle. This is the first time the school board had ever relented on turning a school into a specialty school. And that sort of got me involved in this. And as a part of the battle over North, one of the things that we did is that we went to court to try to get information on grade point averages broken out by race. Because what they used to do is they used to put the grade point averages in the newspaper, and North would always be on the bottom. And of course, the idea was, this is a terrible place. We need to, break it up, get all these kids out of there. But as you all know, Milwaukee, may know, like Milwaukee, like a lot of northern states, had gone through a whole desegregation thing. And in fact, I did my dissertation on the discriminatory implementation of desegregation. Because my view was that in places like Milwaukee, the Brown decision was turned on its head, and that the whole burden for desegregation was placed on the backs of black children. And we can go all the way back to footnote 11 in the Brown decision, start seeing the genesis for why all this occurred. But essentially what was happening is that black children have been scattered out all over the city. So our argument was that we wanted to see how black children were doing in these other schools. And the district lied and said they didn't have that information. So we went to court, and once we got to court, we found out that in fact, not in one high school in the city, including the one for the college bound, that black children have a grade point average over a C. And that in fact, North Division wasn't the worst school in the city for black kids. It was Pulaski, which had a .99 on a 4-point grade scale. So this is sort of my introduction into this whole idea of fighting to try to make sure that low-income black children got an effective education. So one thing led to another, and we had different battles, and I was involved in some other community struggles, and also got involved in an election and went to work for Tony Earl, who was a Democratic governor, and got him to agree to do a study commission where we actually studied the Milwaukee public schools and the surrounding suburban school districts. And what we found was that in every single school in the city, there was this racial gap, between black kids and white kids. And then when you broke it down by class, the divisions were exacerbated. So, make a long story short, we kind of met with the superintendent in what improbably became my conference room. That's a story in itself. But met with them and asked them, why is it that you never told us what was happening? And his argument essentially was twofold. I never will forget it. Number one, black parents can't stand to know how bad their children are doing. And number two, it would give fodder to the racists who believed that black children could not learn. So we were involved in this community struggle to try to get the district to address the educational needs of low-income black children. And when it became clear to us that either they couldn't do it or wouldn't do it, our next step was to try to create a separate school district. And it wasn't that we were trying to secede. I mean, really what we were arguing was that out of the 463 school districts or whatever it was in Wisconsin at that point, the vast majority of them were less than 5,000 kids. So our view was that if we could create a new district out of Milwaukee based on my high school, 2 middle schools, and 7 elementary schools, that maybe we could focus in on the education of the kids. Now, that was because I didn't understand anything. I just thought if the district, we thought if the district was smaller, that you could actually do more for the kids. That was prior to my becoming a superintendent and prior to my visiting Chester, Pennsylvania. But, so we had this view that, a smaller district, we could focus on the kids and so forth. And we actually got Derek Bell to come in and help us with the constitutional arguments because the idea was it was going to be, quote, a black district. And so obviously we're accused of being racist, nationalist, segregationist, separatist, et cetera, et cetera. But essentially our view was that we didn't make these schools black. I mean, they were what they were, and we weren't trying to focus in on integration because that wasn't our issue. We were trying to focus in on could we educate the kids. And we had a black state legislator named Polly Williams, who I went to high school with. And Polly actually introduced the legislation into the Assembly, and it passed the Assembly, and then it was killed in the Senate because a black senator named Gary George did not support it, and he killed it, basically, because they had this caucus rule in terms of how things worked in state government. Okay, so they wouldn't educate the kids. We couldn't have the separate district. So our logic was, well, you won't educate the kids, you won't let us do it, then let us out of here. And I have to tell you that because, you know, it's interesting, when you're black in America and you have a thought, it either has to be liberals or conservatives who planted it in your head. And so depending upon which one of them is laying claim to you or blame on you, you're either duped or you're brilliant. And so I decided that I'm brilliantly duped. But basically what happened is, I mean, obviously I have respect for Milton Friedman and everything, but it wasn't like we were down in my basement, like reading Milton Friedman saying, you know, we need to have choice here, you know, or for that matter, Christopher Jenks. I mean, we didn't, in fact, I never read either one of them before we proposed this. I really didn't learn about Sugarman and Coons and all these people until after we sat in our basement and wrote a manifesto, you know, because I had just read David Walker's Appeal. And I wanted to make sure that when history recorded itself, that there was some group of black people who said, hey, this is insane. And so we wrote a manifesto in my basement, you know, calling for first the creation of the separate district and then afterwards choice. And so the way that the Milwaukee Pro-Choice Program actually happened was that when the vote was, when we were defeated on the separate school district, actually what occurred was Bob Peterkin came to be the superintendent from Cambridge. And he brought with him Deborah McGriff as his deputy superintendent. And they had a kind of controlled choice program in Cambridge. And so Bob and Debbie brought to Milwaukee the idea of breaking Milwaukee up into these areas, you know, like these superintendents create these areas. And then each area has its own superintendent, and then, you know, you got the general superintendent and the area superintendent. So, when this occurred, we actually approached them, and we're having good discussions with them, the community and MPS, Milwaukee Public Schools, about creating some type of modified choice program that the district could support. And so as this discussion was going on, the union got in at the last moment and insisted on some language that was unacceptable to the community. That then led to Polly Williams developing a separate choice bill. And Polly was able to work out an agreement with Gary George because it took both of them to get this done. And I want you all to understand that this occurred when both houses of the legislature were Democrats. And the governor was a Republican. Tommy Thompson. In fact, up until Jim Doyle was elected, there was a lot of people in Wisconsin who never knew that we ever had another governor other than Tommy Thompson. Because if my boss had been there, Tony Earl, it never would have gone through because Tony would have vetoed it. But so interesting enough, the way the alignment worked out, we put this small choice program through the legislature in 1990. And it was a means-tested program. And that's important to me, and I can talk about that because I don't support universal vouchers, and I can explain why and all of that. So it was a means-tested program. It started out with 7 schools. Immediately the union, the ACLU, the NAACP took us to court, got in an injunction, but no, what they did was they got a decision that was against the program, but the program was allowed to continue. No, at first it was an injunction because that's how the private scholarship program started, because these people already had their children in the school when the injunction was announced. And so then we went to another court that allowed us continue even as the program was being litigated. And then in 1995 is when the expansion occurred to religious schools, and then we were back in court for 3 years, and finally the Supreme Court, Wisconsin Supreme Court, ruled in 1998 that the program was constitutional. So that's sort of how we came to the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program. Now, what I wanted to do very briefly is to say to you all that while, and I know that the RAND study, you know, that I read the first and last chapters. If I tell the truth, I didn't read all the middle chapters, but I read. But Dominic, I did read the first chapter and the last chapter, you know, and I actually agree with almost everything you all said in the last chapter. But what I want you all to understand that for me, when you talk about parental choice, it's really about giving parents the option to choose the best school for their children. And so for me, the concept of parental choice or school choice, whatever you use, is broader than just vouchers or charters. So when I think about the concept, I think about the concept as, first of all, as involving schools. So that they're like charter schools would come under this, magnet schools would come under this, contract schools, partnership schools, private schools. And this is very important to me because when we talk about this choice, we sort of collapse everything, you know, into this category. But sometimes you're actually discussing a school. Sometimes you're discussing, and sometimes we do it in combination. Sometimes it's a funding scheme. So, you know, it could be tax credits, and those tax credits could operate differently. It could be like the Minnesota program, or it could be like the Arizona program, or it could be like the Pennsylvania program or the Florida program, where really the difference being that, say, in Philadelphia, the businesses will get a tax credit if they give money to a scholarship program, whereas in Minnesota, you may be talking about an individual tax credit that comes to a family once their tax liability is computed. And if you don't have a tax liability, you can end up getting a credit. So there's different forms of tax credits. The tax deduction, which I do not favor, because essentially it doesn't help low-income parents who don't have a tax liability. So that's one, and then you've got the private scholarship programs. Then you've got the tax-supported programs. So you've got a variety of different funding schemes that allow you to connect to various ones of these schools. Then choice also involves what I would call no school, or no school in the traditional sense. So that to me, homeschooling is like, you know, that's an option. So are virtual schools. And you all are familiar with that, obviously, and you know, as Bennett works on K-12 and all of this, so that you now have virtual schools. Then you have what I would call supplementary educational options, which people are now a lot more familiar with because of No Child Left Behind. So that to me, all of these are, you know, forms of school choice. So that when we're talking about these issues, it's very important that we, you know, look at all of them. And one more that I wanted to just throw up here are what I call enrollment schemes. And enrollment schemes are things like open enrollment or intra and inter-district transfer programs that became very popular, you know, during the integration era. So when I talk about parent choice, I'm talking about all of those things. And the organization that I represent, we support all of these options. And people like to pin you, you know, because vouchers are the most controversial. So anytime you say you're for choice, they call you, you know, I went to Philadelphia and the newspaper called me the voucher man. You know, here comes the voucher man. You know, shut down the batters and stuff. You know, here comes this guy, this terrible guy. So when I look at it, I look at all of these. And so as we talk about choice, understand that a lot of my reactions or my comments will be based on the fact that I'm looking at a larger universe. And, okay, so having said that, let me just say a couple things and then stop and answer your questions. People did ask me kind of what lessons have you all learned. And the first lesson I've learned is there's no public policy that you could possibly come up with that does not have a downside. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's to say, I mean, if I was to stand up in front of you all and say, oh, vouchers will, or parent choice in general will solve all of our problems, you all should collectively leave. Because that would be like a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, because the reality of it is, whether it's vouchers or charter schools or homeschooling, whatever it is, there are pros and cons. And it seems to me that what you have to do at a given point in history is you've got to decide whether the pros outweigh the cons. And that's just dealing with it as, not as an abstract, but just in its purest form. I'm not dealing with the politics of it, because obviously politics is everything. But I'm just saying, you look at the pros and cons in as an objective manner as you can, and you make some decision as to whether or not you think this is good, bad, or whatever. So that's the first point I want to make clear. The second thing I want to say is that I believe deep in my heart, and I've always believed this, is that low-income and working-class people get screwed in America, period. And so it doesn't make a difference what policy you're talking about. Their interests are not at the forefront of political thought in America. And I don't care whether Democrats or Republicans, all rhetoric. When it comes down to it, their needs and interests are not foremost on the agenda. And then when you add race to that equation, it becomes even more pronounced. And the reason why I raise that is because even as we talk about choice, it's like people talk about choice like this is some new experiment. And the reality is that in America, if you got money, you got choice. Because all of us in this room know that no matter how many studies RAND does, the Department of Education does, if you got money and schools do not work for your children, you're either going to move to a community where they do work, or you're going to put them in private schools, and you don't care what kind of reports come out. that is the bottom line. And you know that because, I live in a city, Milwaukee, where we have a program. You have teachers who teach in schools that they would never put their own children in, but they demand that other people's children have to stay there. We had the interesting situation of, and see, I think this is a moral issue. I mean, I know that there's empirical issues and questions, but there are, to me, also moral issues and questions. And the moral issue to me is paramount, and it leads to some of the greatest levels of hypocrisy that I have ever seen. And so we have, for example, a Catholic school in our community that it took a lot to get them to participate in the choice program. And you know why? Because the vast majority of the children who were in that Catholic school were the children of MPS teachers. And they did not want their kids going to school with the children that they taught in the Milwaukee public schools. Now, there is, to me, a certain level of hypocrisy in that. Or you go to the federal level, where we got all of these legislators pontificating, you know, about choice and this and that. When you ask them, where are your children? They're all in private schools. I mean, you take like when Clinton was the president. I mean, he goes in there, you get all these arguments about how, you know, you're draining the best parents. Hell, what better parent would there have been to be in the D.C. public schools than the president of the United States? You'd assume that he'd have a little power to help bring about change. But the reality of it was he did what he and Hillary did, what any good parent would do. They looked around and said, we're not putting our daughter in there. We want our daughter to go to Stanford. We're not, and I don't have no problems with that. The problem that I have is how then do you force other people to keep their children there? I mean, no one has been able to explain that to me in a way that I can understand it. Whatever other issues are floating around. So I've learned that hypocrisy rules. A third thing that I've learned is that that people lie. And so we have a book over there called Lies and Distortions. And people say to me, well, Howard, you can't put that in the title, you know, of a book. That's not like, we don't do that. You know, you got to come up with some other words. And my view was, hey, these are lies and they're distortions. So let's call it what it is. You lying. I mean, you got the ex-governor of North Carolina gets up, getting a big award, gets up and says, the choice program in Milwaukee is allowing rich white people from the suburbs to take advantage of this program. We sent him a letter saying, excuse me, we know that you had bad staff work that day, but here's a couple of facts you might want to consider. Number one, the program is means tested. Hello, so you have to be like 175% of poverty qualified. Secondly, you have to live within the city of Milwaukee. So on both scores, you're spreading disinformation. We're still waiting for the letter to come back saying, I'm sorry, I didn't understand. Because people know that if you tell a lie and you just keep telling it, it will become the reality. We also know that, and I don't mean no disrespect, but many newspaper people are not, you know, Woodard and all them, and they're not down there like looking, you know, and really investigating. So they pick up taglines. And once a tagline gets picked up, it just goes over and over and over again, and you never get out of it. So that's been a huge lesson. Another lesson I've learned is that even amongst people who are trying to be neutral in all of this, there's many times like a bias towards like regulation. And one of the things that I find is really interesting is that we operate as if all of the regulation that we have laid on the public school system has been enormously helpful in educating kids. And so you always find yourself, I mean, I found it as a superintendent, you know, trying to like figure out how do you educate kids in the midst of this? You know, between like contracts, federal and state regulation, board rules. I mean, you'd be sitting in a board meeting and something would happen to the treasurer of the board's child. And we had 154 schools. So you have something happen to one child in one classroom, and there's a new rule that came up that now affects all 154 schools. And you're sitting there trying to figure out, excuse me, could we just deal with this one child? Do we need to establish a whole new set of rules so that this will never ever occur again for this one child in this one classroom, in this one building, in the entire district? And these are all well-meaning people, most of them, you know, who are passing these rules. So the one thing I've learned is that there's just a pull towards regulation, which I thought was interesting in terms of how you and Mike and other people wrote that, dealt with this whole thing about trying to find a balance between regulations that's necessary to meet the public's interest and over-regulating to the point that you create a disincentive for people to become involved. And then the last lesson is that any kind of program that really tries to help low-income people is always going to be at risk. It's just always going to be at risk. It's going to always be at risk because of the politics of it. You know, if there's a budget crisis, where do you go first? I mean, all of these things are realities. But the one thing that I believe in is I don't support choice for ideological reasons. I'm not an ideologue. I mean, I'm not like a free market person or none of this. For me, this is all about trying to find ways to educate kids. And I'm a person who's committed to purpose, not to institutions or systems. And what I find most interesting about all of this is that I'm one of these power to the people folks. You know, I mean, I still got my black leather jacket and stuff, you know, from the Panther days and stuff. So I actually did believe, but now it's just a stylist thing, it's just a leather jacket. But I actually did believe that there was a reason to say power to the people. And what really intrigues me now is that a lot of us, my age and somewhat younger, who would talk about power to the people and fighting the bureaucracy, we are now the bureaucracy. and so all of a sudden we've decided that the people shouldn't be in power. But I'm still at the point where I believe that you never depend upon bureaucracies to serve the needs and interests of the people. That you always got to have the people have some way to confront bureaucracies in the most powerful ways that they can to try to protect their interests. Because bureaucracies do not, in and of themselves, protect the interests of people. They never have, and I don't think they ever will. And so for me, the only way to protect the interests of the people is to empower the people, to be able to protect their own interests and to be able to organize in their own interests. So let me stop, with that and deal with questions that you all have.
I feel your frustration. And what I'd like to hear, and maybe there is no answer to this question, what are the successes?
You know what's actually happening is one of the problems is that there are two levels of success. One of them is that people actually now have a right to choose, and I don't want to belittle that as an important ingredient in this whole thing, because I don't know if you all have ever read this book by Hirschman called Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. And what's interesting is Hirschman doesn't support vouchers, but his argument does, in my opinion, because his theory is that if you have people in an organization and they have no right or no capacity to exit, their voice is diminished. That if you have people in an organization, they have the capacity to exit, it enhances their voice. But if they decide to stay in the organization, because there's something about that organization that's meeting their needs, you will have a deeper form of loyalty to that organization. And I actually believe that to be the case. That when people know that you're trapped and you have nowhere to go, you have no power to go somewhere else, it does in fact diminish your voice. And so to me, one success is the fact that low-income parents, say in Milwaukee, have the right to choose, or the creation of charter schools, or the fact that irrespective of what's happening, people are homeschooling their kids. So to me, that this is a success set aside. But ultimately, you want to look at, well, what impact does it have on academic achievement? And what impact does it have on academic achievement in two places? One is in the places that kids go, but what impact does it have on the larger system? Because, I look at Milwaukee. I care deeply about the kids who are in the Milwaukee public schools. And I'm not a person who sees that there's a conflict between supporting choice and supporting the Milwaukee public schools. In part because I make a distinction between public education, which is a concept, and the system that delivers public education. And my view is that you can come up with a variety of different ways to deliver public education. And that because you get critiqued, as soon as you criticize the system, you get labeled as anti-public education. And my view would be, no, you got to separate those two things. Now, having said that, the only way I know how you can really determine what's happening is you got to study. And in the first 2 years of the voucher program, first 5 years of the voucher program in Milwaukee, we looked at reading and math. And we didn't look at it, John Witte looked at it, because the superintendent of public instruction hated the choice program. And so he gave John Witte sole access to the information for the first 4 years. And John's a friend of mine, I'm not. And he came out, if you recall, with this one, his first year study had one sentence in there that said he did not find any appreciable difference in academic achievement between the kids who were in the choice program and the kids who were in MPS. Shanker picked that up, you know, and put it in his article, and then every place I went, the unions had that, you know, right in your face. Oh, this is what John, one sentence. I told John, I mean, you should have found some different words, but so then for like 4 years we got beat over the head with that. Then on the 5th year, when the information got put out on the internet, then Peterson and Green did their study, and they did find significant improvements in math and reading. You all probably know the story. They're using a different control group, and then Cecilia Rouse said, I'm gonna look at both of these, and she's gonna use a different control group, and she came up with some similar information on math, I think, and not reading, or vice versa. Now, the interesting thing about all this, everyone says that the numbers were so small that really we shouldn't be drawing conclusions from it, that we needed to have a much larger universe of kids. So what we proposed in Milwaukee is a longitudinal study, okay? And what's interesting is we had it in the budget 2 years ago, and the union got it kicked out. And my view is the reason why they got it kicked out is because they want to keep beating us over the head with, you don't want any accountability. Now, but let me explain what the problem is, just so you know. And what I'm trying to do is to speak to that we don't have a lot of information on the achievement side of this because of what has not occurred in terms of being able to study it. The reason why this problem occurred is because if you read the 1998 decision that said that the program was constitutional, one of the reasons why it's constitutional is there's not excessive government entanglement. And so when the decision came down in 98, AFT put on their website right away that the way to kill this program is to insist on more regulation, because if you do, then most of the good private schools will pull out of the program. The other thing that it would have done is that if we would have had like mandated testing from the state, we would also been in danger of being taken back to court on excessive government entanglement. So what we proposed was, let's have the schools volunteer to take all of the tests. But let's not just look at the tests. Let's look at completion rates. You notice I said completion rates, because if you ever ask a superintendent, what's your dropout rate, then that person knows you don't know nothing. And so you really need to ask, what is the completion rate? Like how many start out in the 9th grade and how many finish 4 years later? That's the number you really want. So we need to look at completion rates, parent satisfaction. We need to look at what happens in those transition grades. You know, like the 5th grade if you've got a middle school, or the 8th grade, because that you can learn a lot. So what we want to do is to really have a 10-year longitudinal study. And that instead of just looking at cohorts, that we actually follow kids. And what I would actually like to see is a value-added way of looking at this. And so there's a hearing tomorrow, because we got it back alive again. There's a hearing tomorrow. My hope is that it's going to pass. And what we offered to do was to go out and raise the money privately because of the budget problems, but to put the study under the auspices of the Legislative Audit Bureau. So even though there would be private funds, the study would be controlled by the Legislative Audit Bureau. So, because I actually want to know, because my view is that if it's not working, then we should try something else. You know, because it's not a commitment to it in and of itself.
So what I'm hearing you say, I just want to make sure I understand, you get a lot of bureaucratic inertia against things, but in the small experiment that you did, you saw improvement over a 5-year period.
Yeah, but not in all schools. See, the thing is, I want to make sure that you all are real clear. Just because a school is public is not bad, and just because it's private is not good. The fact of the matter is we have excellent public schools and terrible public schools, excellent private schools and terrible private schools. I'm sure that we have some private schools that take the voucher that are lousy schools for kids. I know we do. And I want to try to figure out how how to get rid of those schools, because unfortunately, just parent choice alone is not doing it, because for a variety of reasons, parents will send their kids,
To a bad school.
right, I mean, they do, and so I want to have personally, like a combination of like parent choice and other mechanisms. Because like right now, even DPI could do certain, Department of Public Instructions could do certain things. So yeah, that's, and that's where we're trying to get to. Now this is just on the voucher side. I haven't even talked a lot about, the other mechanisms like charters, for example, that I'm also knee deep in Wisconsin. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about how it's affected parents, not kids, but has it really changed now that they have the opportunity to exit? Do they feel more loyal? Do they have a greater voice?
You know what's really interesting? I think they do. We got now 11,000 kids in 103 schools. And I've heard some of the private schools complaining that parents, interested enough, we ought to be able to restrict the number of schools that they can go to. And I find that interesting. Because what people are beginning to learn is how to shop. And you can look at that in two different ways. I think there's a positive element in it. And because it means that people are beginning to understand a little bit, what does it mean to have the power to choose? MPS clearly understands it. When I was superintendent, for example, and this is the other important part about the impact on MPS. When I was superintendent, the union head folded his arms and told me over his dead body, would they ever give up on the issue of seniority by building? See, because, I don't know if you remember this now, but I went in there and I said, what I want to do is, I want to close failing schools. That was my big thing, And what I had in mind was the way to change a school was not to get rid of the kids, but how about a new approach? Let's get rid of the adults. Let's leave the kids, get rid of adults, put a great big sign up on the building, open under new management. That was my goal in life. So I went in there, and people just smiled. I was told, yeah, you can do this, but when you reopen it, we will be here because we have seniority by building. We have squatters' rights to this building. It's interesting. Now, 162 out of 165 schools in MPS now have the ability for the teachers and principals and parents to determine which teachers come into their school. It's no longer on the basis of seniority. That makes a huge difference in terms of your ability to try to change a school. We used to have long lines of people from Montessori school. And I said, well, we got all these parents who want Montessori, so why don't we create another? Well, I can't do that. Now, if you have a long line of parents who want a school, they will recreate that school. There's a whole number of things that have happened, and everyone denies that it's because of choice. Oh, no, we would have done this. I can tell you, man, there's no way. And in fact, Milwaukee, the MPS has become really very competitive. I mean, they're having extended day programs, and when people say you need a level of playing field, hell, they are the playing field. I mean, they got all the buses, they got all the money, and once they decided to be competitive, they're drawing kids back into the Milwaukee public schools, which I think is a good thing. Because it means that parents are deciding that what MPS has to offer is something that they want. And so you got parents who are going back. You got other interesting things. You have parents who have one of their kids in public schools and one of them in private schools. Because they look at their kids and they decide, well, this one will be better over here and this one will be better over there, which is what I think you want. So I see it. I don't want to overestimate it. I mean, it's not like, because I don't think we've done a good enough job yet of creating like the consumer reports that parents could really use, because like whenever I go into Best Buy, I don't know what your electronics place is. I like to take consumer reports with me, So when the salesperson, I like, what this model, according to consumer reports, they don't like that. And so what I want to do is, I want to have parents walk in with like a checklist to schools and, ask these questions. It's just like when I had prostate cancer, so they told me, when you go to these doctors, here's a list of questions. And so that's what I want parents, I want them to go in there with like these lists And we haven't gotten there yet, but we're going to get there. And so, yes.
What do you envision to be on that list?
Things like, tell me about your curriculum. Tell me about the various policies that you have, disciplinary policies. Tell me about your policies for involvement of parents. Tell me about how your school is organized. Tell me about your teachers. You know, what are the requirements for your teachers? Tell me about the attendance of your teachers. Tell me about the tests that you give for kids. How often do you give these tests? How do you use these tests to determine what happens to children? You know, we actually have a sheet that we've been working on in the institute that I started. And we're going to try it out and see if it works, or the degree to which it works. Yes?
I was wondering where special education services falls into this framework, since it is so costly and so many of these other organizations are exempted.
Yeah. In Wisconsin, you have a private school statute and a public school statute. On Section 504 and IDEA, the private school statute is not as stringent as the public school statute, and no one should try to pretend that it is. But what is actually happening, and I really don't know how we're going to deal with it, a lot of parents are putting their kids in private schools, but not telling the schools that the kids have an IEP. Because what they're trying to do is to get away from the labeling. And so what is happening is that these kids are exploding in these classes, and people have no idea that there are issues. And even when you do know about IEP, it takes so long to get the paperwork, you know, from MPS sometimes, that it's 6 or 7 months into the school year before you really get an understanding about what these kids' issues are. So what's actually happening on the private school part of it is we are getting kids in who have special needs. What we're probably not getting are the kids, you know, the $50,000 kids or the $60,000 kids. Because when I was superintendent, we had, I remember we had, because I was in charge of human services before I went over to be the superintendent, they had to change the state law for me to be the superintendent because I'd never been a principal or teacher. And according to Ed Week, I was the first of the, whatever, the non-traditional folks or whatever. But I remember I had a woman that I was dealing with in social services. I ran into her when I went over to be the superintendent. She had a daughter who was essentially comatose. But she insisted that her daughter be in a regular classroom because her argument was, you don't know what she's hearing or not hearing. And so she had to have a nurse, and it was a huge cost. Most private schools can't bear that cost because they're not able to, they're not the LEA, so they can't spread that cost, you know, throughout the whole system. For charter schools, though, the way that the law has been interpreted, each charter school is its own LEA. And so what we've had to do, local education agency, I'm sorry. So what we've had to do there is to put together a consortium of the independent charter schools. And we're trying to figure out ways to ensure when you get the $50,000 or $60,000 kid, because if it's one school, it could drive them bankrupt, as opposed to trying to figure out a way to share those costs. Our argument is that that charter schools have to serve all children, but that if you can't serve them in the school, and here's the rub, you contract out for them, just like Milwaukee Public Schools does. See, because we don't, the thing you all need to understand is public schools don't serve all kids, or they don't serve them in the district. But as the LEA, they may find the appropriate place for that child. Charter schools are, you know, we're having issues with that, honestly, because we've got a ruling that's very interesting that MPS is the LEA for private schools, but not for charter schools. So each charter school has to be its own separate LEA. So I don't know if does that answer?
Well, it's also the burden of the cost, so, I mean, because we can say, oh, can't serve the 50,000, but you can argue when you get enough of those, the district bears the cost, and
Right.
it's not getting really paid but 17%.
Yeah, nobody is.
So, but you can imagine a scenario where public schools really become the place, it becomes disproportionately children with expensive special needs, and private schools get to opt out of that because they have less stringent.
Yeah, you could, except if we ever got to that point. First of all, I would argue then that we'd have to talk about schools having to serve all children. Because I mean, just so you know, I actually believe that, and our program is set up this way, is that you can't select kids. That if you agree to be a part of this program, you have to have open admissions. And the fact of the matter is that in Milwaukee right now, the Milwaukee Parental Choice Program is an open admissions program. MPS, I don't know if you all know it, a lot of public schools have entrance requirements to get into public schools. And we actually document that. And I don't know if most people realize that, because most people are floating around here thinking that you couldn't do that in a public school. The fact of the matter is you can, and you do. It does happen. So, but I don't think that any child ought to be put in a place where they can't be appropriately served. And what's really happening is most parents don't seek places where kids really can't be appropriately served. But what's happening in a lot of the private schools is for kids who've got, like, you know, who are not like really physically disabled or severely emotionally disturbed, a lot of these schools have a lot of these kids. They really do. I mean, if you were to come to these schools, you would see that, and what's happening is a number of these schools, like Believers in Christ, for example, they have a total inclusion model. Their whole approach is inclusion. Cameron Institute, for example, spent the first year that they opened, they spent about 6 months weeding kids off of Ritalin that had come into their school. So I'm just saying that a lot of these schools are serving really kids with special needs, but I have to admit it is not the most severely, kids with the most severe needs. Yes.
I think this is related to the success issue. I think the most important part about all these choice options is the extent to which there are competitive effects that ultimately encompass all the kids. So it doesn't really matter if there's a 1/10 of a standard deviation effect for the kids that opted out and are in these other schools now. It's a question of what the competitive effects are.
Right.
And it'd be helpful if you could maybe just pinpoint the specific things that you think you saw in Milwaukee that indicate that MPS responded
Right.
to the choice program.
Yeah, we've got a thing over there that lays it out. I mean, Carolyn Hawksby in her study, talked about actual gains that she saw in the schools that were in those neighborhoods where people would in fact qualify for the voucher. And those who know about that study, she really did see very important gains taking place. But as we've looked at the system overall, the trend lines in education, in achievement have actually been going in the right direction over the 10 years of the program. But where I've seen the impact has been on the way that MPS has responded to parents by creating new program offerings, whereas before they wouldn't, changes in their work rules, having to do with things like teacher assignment. Because about 8 years ago, we did a study of the teacher union contract in Milwaukee, and there was 17 pages on just student assignment. Teacher assignment. So that there have been significant changes in that. The board itself has become a chartering mechanism. Before they wouldn't charter, when we got multiple sponsors, so like the city, I chair the Charter School Review Committee for the city, University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee can charter. Since that occurred, MPS has stepped up its own internal chartering, as well as seeking charters for outside schools. And they've stepped up their efforts to get contract schools. Because if you can go to a school and get a school a contract, you can count those kids in the MPS count. So they become much more aggressive on that. They've always had partnership schools. I'm on the board of Trans Center for Youth. We have 3 partnership schools, which are schools that serve, quote, kids at risk. And now what's occurring, to show you, it's both, see, Dominic, what it is, it's both competitive and collaboration. See, it isn't just the competitive part. It also forces a level of collaboration. And for example, right now, we're collaborating on a $21 million ask to Gates to create small high schools. And so it necessitated MPS to sit down with people like me. I mean, not MPS, but the union. I mean, and they didn't, I mean, I know they didn't want to sit there and stuff, but, you know, we had to sit there, they had to act like, you know, so that we could all come together as a community to go after this grant, because the high schools are clearly not working. Most of these large high schools need to be, like, blown up. And so what we want to do is to take 7 of them and really, you know, do like what they did at Julia Richmond and really locate 3 or 4 different schools in these large buildings. So this is going to be a huge undertaking that's going to take a lot of collaboration between both public and private. You could not have had a situation like this a decade ago. It just would not have occurred. So I want to stress both things that I see that have resulted from let me put it this way. What I've seen is a level of collaboration and a level of change in the way that MPS looks at its programs and looks at the people, particularly parents. And we do have some specific points that are in a couple of those documents over there. And there is a book over there by John Gardner, who is the at-large school board person, laying out the changes that he's seen in MPS that he attributes to choice. Yes.
I was wondering if there's been any discussion about changes to the threshold, meaning that if this program is seen as successful, perhaps you'd think about changing it to 300%
Oh,
of
yeah,
the
yeah,
federal
yeah.
poverty level, rather
Yeah.
than, like you said, 175.
Yeah, we have a coalition of people. Our coalition is really strange. I mean, it's, and what's interesting about it is when we get in a room, you can only talk about choice. You can't talk about the death penalty. You can't talk about affirmative action. You know what I'm saying? 'Cause anytime anything else comes there, everybody like, oh, no, we can't talk about that, because we would just explode. I mean, you couldn't stay in the same room. I mean, it just wouldn't work. You know, so you got low-income parents, you got Catholic schools, Lutheran schools, Baptist schools, you got the business community, you got the Democratic mayor, you got, you know, it's a very interesting coalition. Well, in that coalition, people have different views on universal vouchers. For example, the mayor wants universal vouchers because he thinks it will help keep people in the city. I'm totally opposed to universal vouchers. And so we don't have, so we have unity on the program that we have. Now, there's been talk, I mean, I for one would not be opposed to like a sliding scale. I would not be opposed to, like, you set a certain income amount and you say, if you at this income amount, you get nothing. But if you're here, because I think we ought to try to get the working class parents, my own opinion, so that, you know, you could have some type of sliding scale. Or at a minimum, what we ought to have, and we actually had this until the union kicked it out, was that if you get in at 175% of poverty, you could go up to, say, like 300%. And the reason for that is, you don't want to penalize a person for getting a job, you know, and as soon as they like get a job, you know, you're out, you know, you got $4 over the limit. So, you know, I actually see the value of either a sliding scale, or certainly once you get in, you can stay in up to a certain amount. Or you could, like the Texas bill, for example, that people are putting together. I think they start at 300% of poverty or something. They start at a higher threshold. And I frankly don't have problems with that. I just don't want no means test whatsoever. So. That's my opinion, yes.
At the beginning of your lessons learned, you mentioned that every public policy is going to have its disadvantages.
Right.
Could you outline what you think the disadvantages of?
I think the big disadvantage, quite frankly, and people would be surprised to hear me say this, is the level of polarization that it has created. And so as a result, certain people that used to be my very close friends, we have parted company on this. And ordinarily, we'd be standing on the same side of the barricade, sort of, fighting for kids. And to me, that's been one of the biggest drawbacks to this. And a lot of it has become personal. And people have been demonized, and the level of demagoguery has been such that I don't think these relationships can ever be repaired. And I think that that's, very unfortunate. I think another downside for me, interesting enough, is that the amount of money is, and I end up making an argument to support the program that frankly I don't like, and I want to admit this ahead of time. I'm very schizophrenic about this argument. Because we're in such an austere financial climate, like the state has a $4 billion deficit, I end up making an argument that the choice program is better for the state because it only costs $5,600 versus the $69 that they pay for an MPS kit. I don't like that argument because the reason why I don't like that argument is because I get in trouble with my, quote, conservative friends who start arguing about we can do this on the cheap. And my argument is that anybody who starts with that is not operating in our children's interest because none of y'all have your kids in cheap schools. And so that to me is a real downside to this. And actually because of the way that the state Supreme Court ruled, and there are constitutional issues about whether or not you can give like Catholic schools or these other schools who've been in existence higher than the cost prior to this program. And they do talk about this in the RAND report about how the amount of money that it's cost is distorted. And I think you all call it the difference between an economic cost and something else. What was the other part of it?
Oh, I probably didn't write it.
Right, yeah, right. No, it's something about the economic, it's the real cost versus whatever is the per pupil cost that people lay out. So that even though the Catholic schools or the Lutheran schools may only be saying it costs $4,600, it's probably understated in terms of the amount of money that it actually costs. So there's some real downsides to me on the whole, financing of this and the way that all gets interpreted. The other downside to me is people who then use this for ideological purposes. To argue, for example, that free markets solve all problems, in the world. That, it's things like that that make me very uncomfortable. And I also end up being, you end up sitting down with some people, man, whose worldview, I'm a very narrow person. I'm just looking at this issue. And I understand that you end up, conversing with people and who are on your side, whose worldview is different than yours. But that always happens in coalitions, and you suck it up. And you, but it's an issue. So those are some of the things that I see. Yes.
Earlier you said that you didn't support universal vouchers, but,
Yes.
but you do support school choice. Can you explain that?
Yeah. When I got into this battle, and you all have to understand, I can only tell you how I am, and I'm not trying to argue that it's right or anything. I'm just telling you it's the way I am. I see the world like this, that if you have money, you like right here. If you don't have money, you like right here. And I didn't get in it to do this. I got in it to do this. And so to me, universal vouchers do this. Means-tested vouchers do this. And that's why I'm in it. Because I'm trying to get people who have nothing more if it's universal and everybody gets it, then in my view, the people who are already advantaged will be more advantaged. I'm trying to figure out a way for the lowest income people to be advantaged. That's why when I mentioned the idea of a sliding scale, it fits into sort of a philosophical view that I have, because you still would gain an advantage, depending upon your income. And in the study that Rand did, when they said that you create a situation where basically you would take out the non-choosers, and so that ultimately everybody would be a chooser. The one thing that I worry about in that, and they even say it, is that when you do that, it's clear that certain parents, because of politics and understanding the system and whatever, they're going to be advantaged. That's just the way it is. And so what I'm trying to say is, yeah, but that is just the way it is the thing that most concerns me. So I'm trying to figure out a way to make sure that low-income parents are advantaged. Now the disadvantage, this comes to another question, disadvantage is almost every program that I know of that's been targeted just at poor parents is politically vulnerable. Because you're always trying to, in the American political scene, broaden the number of people who are impacted to create the political base to maintain it. So a means-targeted program runs the disadvantage of sitting out there as a vulnerable type of program. That's a disadvantage. But does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
I'm just curious about other ways of parent organizing as I'm trying to translate this in Los Angeles, where we obviously don't have we have a supply side issue, which means there isn't a lot of choice either for parents. And I know in talking to the LA superintendents over time, that people have said to me, they're just amazed parents aren't marching in the streets, or they've made comments like that we will change LA schools when we turn Palisade schools into multi-track schools, because those parents, which is the rich area, those parents will march. So I'm curious, and the other dynamic we have is we have much larger immigrant population here than Milwaukee, I assume. But are there other major parent organizing techniques around schools that have been successful in very low-income communities? Very low income.
Not a lot that I know of.
And it's not parent choice, which makes sense if you had choice.
Right.
The problem is that it's
Right.
not there.
Well, see, first of all, I don't know what you do in a place like LA. I really don't. I'm not. It's like somebody talking about, I'm the chancellor of the New York public schools. What does that mean? Or Romer, and I've listened to Romer and stuff and been in meetings, and I'm saying, yeah, man, But I don't know what you do. It's so huge. And I've been to charter schools in LA. I remember, I'm trying to think of the one that I was at.
Last learning.
But a good friend of mine is Jonathan Williams, like Accelerate. Because Jonathan is on the board of the Black Alliance for Educational Options. And I see, possibilities and stuff like that. But I don't know how you even talk about managing something like a LA school. In fact, to me, the problem is you can't manage it. And you shouldn't try in the traditional sense. That all the stuff that we study about, management tool, I think you got to have the opposite. I think you have to create something that is unmanageable in a good sense. Because what we have now is unmanageable in the traditional sense. And so for me, the idea would be trying to figure out how do you free people up from, TIAC's one best system. And how do you create a lot of other different possibilities in a place like LA? Different governance arrangements, different collaborations, break up this whole idea of a geographic district. You would just approach the whole thing differently. And I know Paul's going to be here in May. And some of what he's talking about, and I was on the ECS Governance Commission, along with my wife and I, trying to talk about a way to change the whole governance thing. I think you can't leave something like the LA school district intact and think you're going to change it. I just don't see how you can do that. And so some of these ideas that are out here, like charter districts, different types of configurations are things that I think we have to try. And I think you can actually organize parents around some of this. It's just that it's very hard to change school systems, man. And parents, you know, they got their kids there for a set period of time. The amount of time that it takes to like organize and be consistent and fight for change, by the time the change comes, a lot of these parents' kids are gone. You know, they're no longer in the school district. The only constant in the schools district is the union leadership. I mean, and they know where every little memorandum of understanding is, every little, you know, and this is not an anti-union. I'm just saying this just happens to be true. And they see superintendents come and go, you know, and so they have the institutional knowledge and power, in essence. And it's very hard for parents to fight that. So I don't, yes.
Could you comment a bit about the role of philanthropies and the not-for-profit sector in your journey of choice?
Yeah, we've been fortunate in that we've had the support from, I think what Gates is doing is important. It's going to remain to be seen what the impact is, but at least what they're doing is they're saying, we're not just going to spend our money on anything. We're not going to just pour the money into the system. What we want to do is we want to see some radical change. And they've said that the radical change for them is to create small high schools. Now, I don't think small high schools are the end all, but I think they're an important ingredient for a lot of kids. So when you see philanthropy targeted in that way, or we've been fortunate that we've gotten help from John Walton, but you know, to support the charter movement. Because if it wasn't for people like John and some other people around the country who put their money into this, there'd be no way to fight. And what I find interesting is that when you accept money we accept money from the Bradley Foundation, and we've been pillared because of the bell curve. And I sort of find it as like poetic justice that you get money to disprove the bell curve. But that's just my view. It's like you can't fight out here with no money. I mean, with unions, I tell people who look at me like, oh, you're taking money from so-and-so. My view is, well, you're not giving me any. And the reality of it is that you can't fight with no resources. How the hell do you fight? And you got, I go to the NEA, they got a whole floor that's set aside to destroy choice. An entire floor. You know, they got dues, they got all of this stuff. And with this little guerrilla band down here with about in comparison, we got sticks. But I think we're right. And in the end, if you're right and you're committed and you're willing to fight, you can make a difference. But the philanthropy is important because it gives you some of the resources you need to try to sustain a fight over time. And what my argument to the philanthropy people is that, yeah, we like the fact that you support individual charter schools, but you got to support the political instrument that has to surround these schools in order for these schools to continue. Because when you look at a charter school or any school, you can't expect principals and teachers in these schools to lead the day-to-day political battle to exist, because they're down there, trying to deal with these kids, deal with startups, deal with all the problems that you got. For them to be able then to come out and say, okay, we're going to lead the battle up in Sacramento, where it's not going to happen. And so you got to have these political frameworks that are developed in order to fight the battles that you have to fight, and philanthropy is very important to that. I'm not saying it's not also important that they make contributions to individual schools. I'm saying that the larger contribution is for the political infrastructure that's necessary to carry on the fight. Yes?
You've talked a couple times about unions, and maybe you could say something about how the union attitude has or hasn't changed in NPS, and just more broadly, this is kind of comes up as a theme, and I think a lot of us don't as anti-union
Yeah, I
in
know.
an ideological way.
Right.
But in education, it becomes
Good.
sometimes very difficult to
Yeah,
figure
you
out
know-
a strategy for engaging them in some constructive way.
Yeah, here's my argument. My argument is this. I don't take the view that just because you were progressive at one point in history, that by definition, you're progressive at every other point in history. I mean, that's all nice and everything, but I don't buy that. I think anyone who understands the history of American education understands why unions were created. Anybody who don't understand, I mean, you go back and look at Margaret Haley, and you go back and look at what they were going through when AFT got formed. You look at, like even in Milwaukee, they wouldn't hire married women. I mean, the oppression of women, is clear within the whole educational environment. But interesting enough, when the unions got formed, it was the male leadership that really took over, and most of that was because of like the high schools. I mean, when you start studying like what actually happened, and that a lot of these men came out of union entities into high schools and got into the leadership of a lot of unions. But having said that, what I really see the time that I see that things begin to change interesting enough was at the advent of collective bargaining. And I think Wisconsin was the first place that allowed for public employee unions, and with ASME. But once you start focusing on wages, hours, and working conditions as like the critical part, in my view, there was a change in the union's relationship to the community. And when the struggles for community control took place in New York, understanding that some of that got, to be anti-Semitic and all, I understand that. But what also happened in that whole battle was the union's stance against the interests of the community became very clear. And so what I think has occurred over time, and this is not all unions, but a lot of unions' position, it's like the head of the union told me, my job is to protect my teachers. And his assumption was that therefore that was good for kids. My argument was, my job is to protect the kids, which means I have to fight you from time to time to try to protect the kids because you're protecting people who are not necessarily operating in the interests of my kids. And so it's a tough thing for me because, by definition, I'm not an anti-union person. That's not, my upbringing, so to speak. But when I see where the union stands on a lot of issues that I think impacts on what happens to the children that I care most about, I have to conclude that in a lot of instances, their issues are antithetical to the needs and interests of these kids. And that in a lot of instances, they're not taking what I would call a progressive position. And a friend of mine named Bob Lowe, I don't know if Bob actually started Rethinking Schools. And so we're not supposed to be friends, but we are very close friends. And he's a close friend to Harvey Kanter and also Tag. They wrote this book, Schooling During Hard Times. But he and I did an article that we went out to ASA on, where we raised the issue of race as a part of this whole thing. Because we think that a lot of scholars who write about unions take a working class approach to how they view unions. And so the unions are viewed as upholders of the working class by virtue of the fact that they are labor, and labor upholds the interests of work. And we were trying to make an argument that, hey, I don't think so. And then when you put race into this, well, how do you look at what is happening in these large urban areas? And as he and I got deeper into it, we read this book by, there's a book called The Color of School Reform. It kind of put us back because they looked at Detroit, DC, Baltimore, and Atlanta. And in these places, what you have is you've got black control, ostensibly, of the districts, and you have a large percentage of the teachers are black. But what I've concluded is that it's a neo-colonial model. And that what is happening is that neocolonialism, functions just like colonialism. And so just because you put black faces in what used to be high white places, that doesn't mean that liberation is at hand for poor people. So it's a very difficult thing for me to do. But in the end, I've concluded that a lot of what unions are doing today, teachers unions, is not in the interests of the black and brown children that are being served in a lot of these school districts. Now, I want to make a distinction between the organized union and individual teachers and individual collectives of teachers that operate within these districts. Because even some of the people who I have the strongest arguments against because of choice, I actually respect what they do for kids. Because I know what they do for kids on a day-to-day basis. And while we disagree on choice, I can't disagree with the kind of work that they do for kids on a day-to-day basis. And that to me, and some of these people are in unions and some of them are not active within unions. So it's a tough scenario.
How do you name the political support, the school board, for instance, to kind of keep this program going, given exactly the conflict that you've outlined, and we've just gone through that in LAUSD.
Yeah. Well, first of all, the school board doesn't control this, okay? And we're about to have an election in Milwaukee, and the whole school board could change. What the school board controls are chartering, but they have no control over vouchers. That program is a state program, and it's the state legislature that we have to deal with, not the school board.
But for chartering too, I'm assuming
Right.
that's a kind of important piece of.
Yeah, they are an important piece. So we're going to have an election that may change. See, this is the other thing about school district. You're always one election away from everything changing. And it doesn't take, you don't have to change the whole board. You just got to change a couple of people, and it can change the whole thing. And the interesting thing, it goes back to the union thing. What I found as a superintendent, what I thought was the greatest joke was we would have these executive committee meetings of the school board to discuss our strategy for dealing with the union. And the union was in the meeting because there's 2 or 3 people who owed their existence to the union. And we'd go through this charade. We're not going to tell them. I always found that to be laughable. They knew our strategy before we even got out the room. School board. See, school districts are closed entities. They're low turnout elections. People have been in there for years, controlling stuff. Husbands, wives, sisters, brothers, nieces, nephews. You have people who used to be in the union who move over and become central office personnel. It's one of the most closed systems that you could ever think of. That's why it's so difficult. One of the reasons why it's so difficult to get significant change, because it's not an open type of system. And so when Sheldon Moe wrote that book about markets and stuff, they were trying to get at that. I don't know what John thinks now, but they were trying to get at some of those issues, and it just makes it very difficult. So in Milwaukee right now, we have a school board, but we got the 5 people who support reform are all up for election, and the chances of all 5 of them being elected again, I don't know. It's not that great. Well, it's 11:30, and I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot.